Hello, let us have a chat about the book I just finished. Orphans of the Sky by Robert A Heinlein. So my edition is not by any means an original edition because this was first published in 1941 and it wouldn't have been in this great a condition. It was originally published in Astounding Science Fiction as two parts. The first part, the novella Universe, was originally published in 1941. And it was probably published alone at some stage as well, but part two, Common Sense, followed it a month or two later, if I remember correctly, which I may well not. So they were first published together in book form in 1963, and so this is from 1987, my little ace edition with its rather naff cover, which I do not believe in any material way significantly represents what's inside the book. So every place that I've looked online says that this represents one of the earliest interstellar arc generation ship type stories. I rather think this might be the earliest, because if you know of a generation ship story that predated 1941, I'd be fascinated to hear, but I haven't read it, I don't think, if it exists. So in this particular case, you've got this ship that was heading for Proxima Centauri, and we know that from the tiny little teaser that we have in the introduction to chapter 1, where it says the Proxima Centauri expedition sponsored by the Jordan Foundation in 2119 was the first recorded attempt to reach the nearest stars of the galaxy. Whatever its unhappy fate, we can only conjecture. No, we don't have to conjecture. Robert Heinlein tells us all about it. Universe was selected for a Science Fiction Hall of Fame thingamajig. I enjoyed it. I like Heinlein in general. I think a lot of the concepts were good as an adventure story. Well, Heinlein's adventure stories are always pretty good. This is one. In the first part, Universe, we follow our main protagonist throughout, which is Hugh Hoyland. He's a young man who's adventuring in the ship. In his society, you've got the crew, which inhabit and maintain the ship. But the ship has descended into a semi-feudal community, and no one there knows. They call it a ship, but they don't believe that there's anything outside it. They believe that their ship is the whole universe. There's virtually no education system. No one knows anything else. They live in the semi-feudal class system. You've got one class, the scientists, the elite, but they're more like a priesthood than a scientist. They don't actually know any science, and their education, while is better than the peasants, is not that great. The peasants are what it says. Allegedly, they farm animals and maintain hydroponic crops. Heinlein doesn't go into this in too much detail. We collect that this ship has been going for generations, and how exactly all this would still be running would need some pretty fancy footwork, and Heinlein just never did that. The scientists ritualistically feed all the trash, including dead people, into the converter, which is a mass-to-energy concept, generates power. But they are ignorant of how it works. They've got protocols like guarding it, but that's about it. The crew is ruled by a captain, and it's a very minimalistic society, and Heinlein gives it very minimalistic attention. We start with Hugh. Hugh is one of his boyish adventurers, not a particularly nice person. He's taken a group of his friends up to explore the outer reaches of the ship. The area where the crew lives, there is gravity and all that sort of thing, but as you go further out, the gravity reduces and muties creep in. At one point, Heinlein, probably through Hugh, but through a character, talks about what exactly mutie represents. It could represent mutants, because they are mutants, and we later learn that the shields on the ship disintegrate during a mutiny. That's the other thing they could be. They could be named muties as the inheritance or the descendants of the mutineers who were banished to the outer low-level area. They don't have a crop-based system, and it sounds very much as if Robert Heinlein is suggesting that their sole food is cannibalism. A C word that used to get people banned on older platforms. I hope it doesn't ban me here. Throughout the ship, good eating is the standard greeting and farewell. As with the muties, as with the crew. What else the muties could possibly eat, unless they occasionally raid crops, which wouldn't happen very often, is left to the imagination. Left to the imagination also is how our entire class of, we gather, a lot of people could survive on a solely cannibalistic diet, but I won't go there. So Hugh Hoyland is off on one of his expeditions one day when he's captured by the muties. And the one who captures him is an extremely strong, though possibly dwarf, I'm not sure. Bobo's never described as anything but microcephalic. Microcephalic meaning tiny brain, and it's a phrase that a lot of the early science fiction writers liked and used a lot. I do not really like that phrase. I think they were talking about an actual mutation. Anyway, moving on from that one as well. So Bobo is incredibly strong. He takes Hugh captive, is planning on eating him, but Bobo is the slave of a pretty, not the head mutant, but a head mutant who runs his own little gang, Joe Jim. Joe Jim is a type of mutation. He has two heads. Think Zaphod Beeblebrox, and they chat with each other, but they have separate personalities. And the Joe Jim is actually scientifically, I'm not going to say plausible under this scenario because he's a fully grown adult and he's smart, he's fairly educated, he keeps books and he reads them. But two-headed humans are known as dicephalic paraphagus twins, and they do exist. They're a variation on conjoined twins. The way Heinlein imagines this as two characters inhabiting one body, that is not how it works, but his creation of this particular mutant with two heads was based on a type of science. You need to cling to those types of science as much as possible because this book is a little bit superficial in many ways. So Bobo brings Hugh to Joe Jim and he becomes a slave of him. They keep him as a slave for quite a long time, but eventually one day during a debate, Joe Jim takes Hugh up to the no-wait area and shows him the captain's lounge, the control room. And he then takes him onto a captain's something else, viewing room, something like that, where you can see out and see all the stars. In this way, Joe Jim convinces Hugh that the ship isn't indeed the whole universe, but it's a ship traveling through the universe. And he also shows in various books that make it clear that it was actually meant to travel to a star system, as we, the reader, already know from the introduction, Proxima Centauri. Okay, they find out eventually that the starship is called the Vanguard, which is worth remembering. Now, it's been traveling without any guidance through international space for quite some time, and I don't think that it's in the first book that we actually ever find out how that happened. I think that happens in part 2, Common Sense. Now, having been convinced of the ship's true nature and its purpose, Hugh manages to persuade someone from the crew that this is the case. This is where we learn that Hugh's probably been gone for a very long time, but again, that's not gone into in any great detail. Hugh brings a mate of his from childhood, Alan, and the now head engineer who he used to know, Bill, to the control room to show them the stars. Now, in the second part, Bill goes to enlist the captain Well, not the captain, the captain's aide, and then things go kind of pear-shaped, which I'm not going to talk about too much because I think a lot of people who enter their classic SF and like Heinlein could enjoy reading this book. We do at some point learn about the mutiny and how that happened and how they happened to be going through space knowing nothing about their world. I feel that this book has a few flaws. The writing is superficial. At times, I know this isn't one of Heinlein's juvenilia. Heinlein's juvenilia are very prescribed in scope. They're the ones he wrote for Scribner. Even later ones that, like Starship Troopers, which he wanted to be one of the juvenilia, isn't technically considered one. One much later, Podkind of Mars, which certainly ticks every teenage box you can imagine, is not considered one of the true juvenilia. And this one certainly wouldn't be either. I'm pretty sure it was written and published in 2 parts before the juvenilia with Scribner ever existed. It feels juvenile though. It feels really old school, amazing stories, pulpy. There's not a huge effort to make characters. The adventure is the whole of the thing. And it's got some issues. I've seen people describe it as really violent, which I don't actually agree with. There is violent, but it isn't particularly graphic, and it's inherent to the story. All the crew and the muties carry knives, and they kill each other with them. The theme of cannibalism is not ever gone into in any heavy detail. Good eating, or he's all yours, Bobo, is about the closest we get. We know it's happening, but I don't find it particularly offensive, and I think most classic readers won't either. What some classic readers will find heavily offensive is the level of misogyny. I keep running into books where I have to say that word. Written in 1941, obviously females in 1941 had a slightly different treatment in literature, but not all literature, and rarely is bad. I think there's only actually 3 or 4 females ever mentioned in this book. They are not really treated like humans. It is a problem. The first one is when Hugh comes back from one of his expeditions. He goes to his uncle's house. His uncle is he's apprenticed with his uncle, and he says hello to his aunt, who ducks her head, lowers her eyes, and brings him food without saying anything, as is appropriate for a woman. It's classic science fiction. I'm not offended by it, but I know a lot of people out there will be. And if you're a newer reader and you're used to any sort of equality, you may not like it. Now, later on, when Hugh comes across the diary of the captains of the ship that's been hidden in an escape pod, which they later use, he comes across the last entry that's put in, and it was by, I'm going to say it was probably a female captain because it's signed off as the name Jean. Jean can be a male name, but I think this was Heinlein trying to suggest that the original captain, original crew, scientific crew and staff were much more equally based, and that by descending into basically barbarism and feudal society, they had lost any advances of equality that existed in 2119 or whenever it was that the ship left. That's what I think Heinlein was doing. But I know that there's a lot of people out there who will not read far enough to reach that conclusion or that point. They will be too outraged. It's not the best written thing, let's face it, in the world. You've got to be there for the classic SF. You've got to be there for the generation ship, or you've got to be there for the adventure. Now, the reception of this book was apparently really, really good. Damon Knight, whose reviews I don't always agree with, though I do like his stories, said no one has ever improved on Universe. Because Heinlein said it all. You are wrong, Damon Knight, or you were wrong in 1956. There's plenty of other generation ships out there, and I'm going to say many of them, many are better. Various other people said various things. Algis Budrys loved it as well, but he loved Heinlein's impeccable statement on the theme as well. Various other people have talked about it. I'm going to mention 1980 cultural historian and scholar. I'm reading off Wikipedia here, by the way, in case you're wondering. Yes, I do contribute to Wikipedia. H. Bruce Franklin described Universe as a classic presentation of critical social problems of isolation, and he compares it with Christopher Priest's Inverted World, which I'm going to say is one hell of a lot better written than this, and talks about all of that. But he dismissed the second part of the novel, Common Sense, as a more minor tale of adventure, concluding with a highly improbable end, which it is a highly improbable end. And I'm going to share it. Anyhow, other interesting things about this for the dedicated Heinlein reader are that it ties in repeatedly with other things that he wrote. So our two-headed mutant Joe Jim, one head is Joe, the other's Jim, they argue a lot, at one point is talking about the works of Risling, the blind singer of the Spaceways. Risling is a poet, and he's a central character in a story, The Green Hills of Earth. Great story, by the way. Heinlein liked that story, and Riesling features as a mention, like we would mention Milton or Wordsworth, in quite a few of his other stories. Okay. In 1973, Heinlein wrote a book that was part of the Methuselah's Children, Lazarus Long series. It was called Time Enough for Love. Not entering into any debate on that. It's painful every time. But the Vanguard is briefly mentioned in that book, and I think elsewhere in the series, as being the sister ship of New Frontiers. New Frontiers is the story which in Methuselah's Children is illegally commandeered by the Howard families in order to escape from Earth, which has gone fully racist, anti-Howard families on them, and is killing people left, right, and center. So it's mentioned in Time Enough for Love that the vessel had been bound for Proxima Centauri but never landed colonists there. And at some point in the Heinlein verse, the Vanguard is discovered with all of its crew dead because of an unexpected failure in its mechanisms. Its records have been destroyed or illegible. In these books, it talks about how people are feeding books into the mass converter because very few people and none of the crew, except a couple of scientists, can read, so they place no value on books. The path of the Vanguard is traced back, and the descendants of Hugh's people are found on a planet, which brings me to the final, highly improbable ending of this book. So Hugh and Joe Jim make an agreement with the aide-de-camp of the captain. This ends up with the aide killing the captain, taking over the captaincy, and as soon as he does that, he betrays Hugh, Joe Jim, and all the others. He claims that he never ever believed the ship was actually traveling through space, and to us, the readers, it's been quite clear throughout that particular story that he was stringing them along basically because he wanted to be captain. At this point, Hugh and a few of his good mates and their women, let's not even, escape in a landing pod, apparently the only landing pod left on the ship, and they land on this new planet, where later in the Heinlein verse, they are discovered as being highly intelligent savages. The fact that they're highly intelligent seems unlikely to me, but the fact that they would survive from such limited stock is unlikely enough, but we won't even talk about it. Okay, scientifically plausible. Well, a lot of this is, I've mentioned the biological mutation element. Heinlein did like making science in his books, and the centrifugal force which produces the artificial gravity is a common science fiction trope. But lots of elements of this spaceship are actually consistent with physics, at least as you knew that in the 40s and the 50s. I think parts of it have not aged well, but the whole notion of many of the elements of the ship could be logical. The planet, the habitable moon of the giant planet where they land is vaguely consistent with reality, at least, or at least as they believed it at the time. There's lots of things in here that are sciencey, but he never goes into any of them in any detail. In fact, he goes into very little in this detail where there's social, scientific, or whatever. Nevertheless, it is a short story, which is lucky because I've been really busy. 150 pages in my Ace edition. It's certainly not going to be for everyone. The writing is probably the most clumsy and the most basic that I have ever seen from Heinlein. I would argue that that is the case for both of the sections, the first one and the second one. Throughout the first section, the universe, part 1 universe, I was often thinking that it read like a juvenilia simply because of the superficiality of the writing. And the second one is even more poorly written, if possible. Let's face it, though, a lot of early science fiction that came to us through the pulp magazines wasn't always well written. It often was about the concepts. And for many of us who are into the classic science fiction, it is the concepts that really drew us in and have kept us interested in it. So, Orphans of the Sky. If anything of that sounds interesting, by all means read it. If you've read it, I'd love to hear your opinions about it. If you didn't finish it, tell me why. I think I can guess, but I will be amused. I would probably rate this 2.5 stars out of 5, or a very generous 3, simply because I did quite enjoy it. I like Heinlein as an author in general. If you do not like Heinlein, you will not like this one. So, pros, cons, yes, no, go away, read good books, this one or any other one. Bye.